I am so delighted to speak to the League of Women Voters because I think you are an important part of the solution to the challenges that we are finding right now. Efforts to use disinformation to sow division in society, to confuse people about issues, to dampen voter turnout. And the very purpose of this organization is to provide voter education in a nonpartisan way to give voters the information they need to make informed choices at the polls. And so what a joy to be with all of you, and I really admire the important work that you do. I appreciate that there are women here and that there are men here, because the mission of this organization is not only nonpartisan, it favors no gender. It is all about education of voters to make sure that voters have the power we need in our democracy. And that's really what my book is about, Attack from Within, How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. It is about this assault on truth to try to divide us against each other and to try to steer us into voting for people against what our good information would tell us to do. And I believe it's having a corrosive effect on our society. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the book and why I wrote the book, the thesis of the book, the harms I'm seeing, and maybe some of the solutions that I propose. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about my view about truth and the importance of truth in our society. And I'm sorry to be speaking with my back to you folks. I'll try to keep everybody in view here. I just don't want to have a podium between me and you, right? My friend Ann Doyle here, who's a master communicator, told me, don't put anything between you and the audience, right? A lot of great advice I've received over the years from Ann Doyle. Power Up, great book by Ann Doyle. But I spent my career working as a prosecutor where truth actually matters in a courtroom. Truth really matters, right? You cannot say anything in court unless you can support it with evidence, a document, an object, an eyewitness. Only then, with that kind of attribution, can you make a factual assertion in court. And so perhaps it is why I am so deeply offended when I see people run afoul of truth, or, in common parlance, lie. I don't know why it is, but the media is often very concerned about lying. Even yesterday when Michael Cohen was on the stand being cross-examined, you said X, and today you said it's not X. Isn't it true that you lied? He would say, I'll concede that it was inaccurate. Like, just say it was a lie, it was a lie. You're a liar. We tiptoe around that word so much, but truth matters. Liz Cheney said during the January 6th investigation, we cannot reject truth and remain a free country. Truth, information, accurate information, facts, that is the foundation of democracy. The key to a democracy is an informed electorate and informed about facts. We all certainly have the ability to choose how we view those facts. You may have extremely conservative views. You may have extremely progressive views. You may be somewhere in the middle of all of those things or all across the spectrum. That's fine, but we have to agree on what those facts are before we can have any kind of meaningful debate. And so I came up in a court system where truth actually matters, and I learned a lot of important things about truth and integrity and ethics in my work. As you heard, one of the focuses of my career was public corruption, and not committing it, but enforcing it. Sometimes people say, she is specialized in public corruption and terrorism. Like, wait, I didn't do those things. I enforce those things. But one of the more significant cases that my office handled during the time I was serving as U.S. Attorney during the Obama administration, it was from 2010 to 2017, was the prosecution of Kwame Kilpatrick, the former mayor of Detroit. And in case you don't remember, he was convicted after a lengthy trial of extortion, bribery, fraud, and tax offenses for an $84 million scheme, mostly around shaking down contractors for water and sewer contracts, which are incredibly lucrative. But I learned in the investigation of that case not only about how one individual can go astray, but what can happen in an organization when there is a culture, not of integrity, but a culture of corruption. And that is what we saw within the city of Detroit government at that time. Because it wasn't just Kwame Kilpatrick who was convicted of public corruption offenses. There were also 30 members of his administration or businesses doing business with the city of Detroit who were also convicted of public corruption crimes during that same period. Many of them did not get the same attention. You know, they might have been lower level people, but what they saw in that organization is that's how business is run. That's just the way of doing business here. In the same way, some of us, well, some of you, some friends, maybe not me, but other people might think it's okay to go 5 miles an hour over the speed limit. I'm just saying, other people tell me sometimes they think that's okay. You know, that it's no big deal to exceed the speed limit by maybe 5 miles an hour. Like, that was just the culture, right? It was ingrained, like, that's okay. That's the way people do business in the city of Detroit. And so people would set up their own consulting businesses and require citizens to first hire them as a consultant and pay a consultant fee of $5,000 just to get them to do their job. If you wanted a license to a construction permit or something like that, you had to first pay the consultant just to get them to consider your application. And so in this way, it became the culture of enriching yourself. You know, well, I'm an overworked, underpaid public servant, and this is the benefit I get in exchange. And that is no way to run a government. But that culture of corruption is something that I learned. If the leader gives not just license, but shows by example, this is how things get done, then pretty soon that becomes the norm. And people begin agreeing that this is okay. I think that's something we're seeing in our society today, where we have people at the top saying things that are not true and giving license to other people to say those things, or to say things that are coarse and cruel and crude and nasty, and giving license to other people to say those things, because that culture is contagious. Good behavior is contagious, and bad behavior is contagious. And so when someone like Donald Trump refers to the January 6th defendants who have been convicted of crimes like assaulting police officers, trespassing, obstructing an official proceeding, when he calls those people who are jailed for those crimes hostages, we're now hearing other people echo that phrase, right? Because he's made it okay to refer to them as hostages. They know better. They know they're not hostages, but it creates this impression that they are political prisoners. So Representative Elise Stefanik of New York, who certainly knows better, is now calling them hostages. And Marjorie Taylor Greene in Georgia is now calling them hostages, because Donald Trump has created a culture where it's not just okay, but it is favorable to engage in this kind of misleading disinformation. So culture is something that matters so much, and that I learned in my work as a prosecutor. I also learned about how people are willing to accept the word of an authority figure without a lot of questioning or suspicion. And I learned this in a case we prosecuted against an Oakland County oncologist named Dr. Fareed Fata. I don't know if anyone remembers this doctor. We have a former patient of Dr. Fareed Fata, a well-known and very prominent and highly regarded oncologist in Oakland County. He had built up 7 different offices around the county. He had his own pharmacy. He had his own lab, which is part of what enabled his fraud. But he was ultimately convicted of diagnosing patients with cancer when they did not, in fact, have cancer. He lied to them about having cancer. And why? So that he could administer expensive chemotherapy treatments to them and earned $34 million in false Medicare billings. So it was lucrative business. When patients first learned that they had been defrauded by Dr. Fata, they were at first very skeptical. That can't be true. He's my doctor. He cured me of cancer. Well, you know, it's easy to cure someone of cancer if they never had cancer to begin with. It was really breathtaking, the audacity of the fraud. We were able to identify 515 patients who were abused by Dr. Fata, and while most of them who were still living were pleased to learn that they did not, in fact, have cancer, many of them had suffered permanent damage, including loss of teeth. Their hair grew back mostly, nerve damage, organ damage, because when you take chemotherapy, as you know, it is ingesting poison. You poison the cancer cells to kill them off. But there are all kinds of collateral effects that are bad for your body. And not only did Dr. Fata administer chemotherapy, he was very, very aggressive about it. He said, you need to be very aggressive. These are the treatments. Because for every vial of chemotherapy that he administered, he made more money that he could bill to Medicare. And so what was the lesson of Dr. Fata? I think it was questioning authority. People were so believing in him and his reputation as this great doctor. And when people did question and say, are you sure my spouse really needs that much chemotherapy because they're really suffering? I've talked to friends and they say that the amount of treatments that you are giving is far more than anyone I know has ever received. And he would push back and say, do you have a medical degree? Have you saved cancer patients? Did you go to Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital? And people would say, no, no, no. And so they trusted him because he was an authority figure. He had the degrees, he had the experience, he had the reputation. And this is also something that I think we see in society today. When leaders who have a position of authority say things, people believe it to be true without pushing back and asking questions and demanding the evidence behind the things that we are hearing to be true. We need to be active consumers. We need to be active members of our democracy and ask questions and push back and not just assume that things are true just because someone tells us so. We hear that Mexico is sending their animals and criminals and rapists. Is that true? I don't know. We have issues we need to solve at our border, but we allow politicians, I think of every stripe, to frame the narrative in terms of things that get us emotionally charged without really focusing on the facts so that we can make the kinds of compromises that are necessary to advance our society. They'd rather gin up our anger than focus on unity and facts and solving problems. So that was another lesson. And then another lesson I learned in my work as a prosecutor was the cover-up is worse than the crime. Wasn't that the lesson of Watergate? I mean, we're all old enough to have remembered Watergate, right? It seems that this is a lesson that people have to learn again and again and again. If I were the kind of person, Jerry, who committed crimes, and I were advising people who commit crimes, I would tell them, don't cover it up for the love of God. That's a gift to prosecutors. When you cover it, may be they can't prove the underlying crime, but when you cover it up, you destroy evidence or you tamper with witnesses, that's a separate crime. You've just made it so much easier for the prosecutor to convict you. And not only will they charge you with that obstructive crime, now that itself becomes evidence of the underlying crime because it's what prosecutors call consciousness of guilt, right? If you didn't think you were guilty, you wouldn't need to destroy the tapes or tell the witness to lie for you. So it suggests that you know that you committed a crime and that you're trying to cover it up. I will tell you the saddest example that I had of that when I was serving as a prosecutor. In the late 1990s, I was assigned to handle the arson, or at least the suspicious burning of the United Way building in Ann Arbor. I don't know if anybody remembers this. The building burned to the ground. It's located at Platt and Washtenaw. And overnight, huge fire, fire responded, burned, but it was completely destroyed. And the case was investigated, and ultimately a plucky young prosecutor was able to crack the case by learning that same night a young man had checked into the University of Michigan Hospital with burns all over his body. It didn't take a lot of work to figure out who did it. So he was about 20 years old. He worked in the building, and as we asked questions, we learned that he had been working in the building, and his mother owned a nonprofit there that helped first-time home buyers obtain loans who might not otherwise qualify for loans through traditional channels. Wonderful nonprofit, lots of other nonprofits in that building along with the United Way. He had a summer job there. He was a student, a college student at the time, and one of his, he just did odd jobs around the office. One of his jobs was to go out and get office supplies or cleaning supplies at Home Depot or Office Max or these kinds of places. And he would take cash and he would buy the items, and then it turns out he would pocket the cash. And as the summer went on, his mother said, I need those receipts for every penny you spend because we're scheduled to be audited at the end of the summer. So whenever you spend money, I need the receipts. Make sure you give them to me. And he said, yeah, I'll get them to you. Yeah, I'll get them to you. Yeah, I'll get them to you. Well, finally the day came and she said, I have to have those receipts. The audit is tomorrow. Give me the receipts. Well, he didn't have them because he'd been pocketing the money, maybe about $200 total. And so rather than confess to his crime, confess to his mother what he had done, and admit shame, that night he burned down the building. Because if there was no building, there would be no receipts, and there would be a convenient reason that there wouldn't be. What an example of how the cover-up is worse than the crime. He ended up serving 5 years in prison. He was remorseful. He admitted his crime. But imagine if he'd simply admitted to his mother, all I did was steal $200. She would have been angry. He might have been fired. I doubt there'd be a criminal prosecution for $200. And not only did that business lose its office space, so did the United Way, and so did dozens of other small nonprofits that were located in that building. So the cover-up is often worse than the crime. And that is so often what we see motivating lies, right? That people want to cover things up. Right now, this trial against Donald Trump that is currently going on in New York is really all about a cover-up. There was, allegedly, according to the prosecution, a conspiracy to hide adverse information on the eve of an election, and then false documents designed to cover it up. Because if they admitted the campaign paid $130,000 to a porn star named Stormy Daniels, that would sort of defeat the purpose of paying hush money in the first place. And so instead, what they did was falsify business records, which is a crime, violating campaign finance disclosure laws, which is another crime, and exposing themselves to criminal prosecution. Perhaps the best advice at all is don't have an extramarital affair with a porn star. But that's a different lesson for another day that I will discuss with my children. But as you can see, in courts, truth matters. Truth still matters. In court, as an officer of the court, you can't just make stuff up. It matters. And I think it matters in society as well, which is why I believe this assault on truth is so corrosive to our society. Which leads me to the book that I wrote, Attack from Within. One of my main areas as a prosecutor when I was an assistant U.S. attorney was national security. And I teach a course in national security now at the University of Michigan Law School. During the time that I was a prosecutor, I really saw the threat to our national security evolve from Al-Qaeda to ISIS to Russia to China. And now I think the greatest threat to our national security is this threat of disinformation from within our own country. One of the assignments I give to my students in my national security class is to read the Mueller report. Remember the Mueller report? But I think when most of us hear the Mueller report, we think about what it did or did not find with regard to Donald Trump and the 2016 presidential campaign. But the parts of the report that I have the students read is the part about Russia and its disinformation campaign relating to that election, because it is incredibly eye-opening about what happened in that election. Mueller and his team were able to identify hundreds of social media accounts that had been set up by a group called the Internet Research Agency in Russia and its operatives. And they created accounts online on Facebook, Twitter as it was then called, YouTube, and other social media platforms with names that pretended to be American grassroots political activists. So they had names like Tennessee GOP, Heart of Texas, United Muslims of America, Blacktivist. And for many months, they patiently cultivated followers. They even paid for ads to boost some of their reach and exposure. But by the time the election came along, they had hundreds of thousands of followers in the United States for all these accounts from people who believed that they were real people. They'd sprinkle in funny little yarns about, haha, today I took my daughter to the park, or yesterday we went to the ball game, to make them look like they were an ordinary person, just like you and me. But then, as the election approached, they started pushing narratives. For those who were purporting to be Christians, they would say things like, if Hillary wins, the devil wins. For Blacktivists actually posted something just before the election that said, Hillary Clinton has never done anything for our community. We should send her a message by staying home on election day. We will never know how many people heeded those requests, but in an election that was decided by a narrow margin in certain swing states, even a small number of people who were persuaded could have had a significant impact on the outcome of the election. And so that is really eye-opening to me, and now we see those same strategies being used from within our own country. And so the thesis of my book is really twofold. One is that social media has really made the ability to disinform people incredibly easy. Never before have we had this power to send a message instantly to reach millions of people and to do so anonymously. You can send a message that people will believe to be true. I saw one a couple of weeks ago that I am speculating, but I am certain is a fake designed simply to sow discord in society. And that was one of Mueller's conclusions, that the idea was to get us really mad at each other by choosing all of the fault lines in society, right? What are the issues? Guns, the LGBTQ community, abortion, immigration, and then really say outrageous things on both sides of that issue to get people really mad at the other without realizing that the person who posted that was not a member of the LGBTQ community, but a Russian operative trying to look outrageous to inflame the passions of people on the other side of that issue. And so that is something that we have seen through social media in an effort to sow discord. But the one that I saw that I'm convinced was a fake was this one. Maybe some of you saw it. It was making the rounds on social media a couple weeks ago. And it was a teenage girl dressed in her prom dress, looking beautiful, and a teenage boy dressed in his suit. The girl was white and the boy was black. And next to it, in a very professionally done, suspiciously professionally done manner, was a text chain that the girl claimed was from her father, with the most awful racist rant you have ever seen in your life. My father said, I'm dead to him. Here it is. You know, you're dead to me. I'm canceling your phone. How dare you bring this such and such home to our household? And then hundreds of people were responding. That's awful. Look at these racists. It's so terrible. I can't believe it. I think it's a fake, right? It's designed to just generate this outrage. Because who posts that online about their own dad, right? If this happened, it would be incredibly hurtful. It just looked a little too nicely done. The boy and the girl were beautiful, like models. I really think it was a fake, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, just to gin up that sort of outrage. So that's one of my theses, that social media is making disinformation. Why are we having this problem now? It's because of social media. But I think there's something else afoot, which is this assault on truth. And I think that is, the social media is just the how. This assault on truth really is the why. Why would people want to do these kinds of things? And I believe it is because it is a strategy of both political parties since 2000 to not any longer cultivate and court the moderate middle, the swing voter, the independent, the normal common sense people who vote independently and decide from election to election who they might vote for. Instead, what they decided was more effective was to double down on their base. That's the phrase that gets used. It was a strategy developed by Karl Rove for George W. Bush. It worked beautifully, and so the Democrats have copied it. And the idea is, it used to be in the primaries, they'd swing left or swing right, and then for the general, they'd come back together and, what do they call it? Pivot to the center. And cultivate those moderate voters and try to persuade them. What they learned with the ability now to cultivate data and crunch numbers is a much better bet, frankly, is to double down on your base, to get them to show up, because if they show up and vote, they are confidently in your column. They will be a reliable vote for you. These middle-of-the-road people, who knows how they're going to vote? I'm not sure I want them showing up to the polls. In fact, I'd like them not to show up to the polls. I'd like them to be disgusted and exhausted and to say, I can't vote for either one of them. I want to hold my nose. They're terrible. I'm going to stay home. But it's the base who's really excited to come out and vote. And so how do I generate excitement for the base? By convincing you that the other side is the devil, and this is an existential election, and this is a must-win election. We must all show up. And how do I do that? By appealing to your emotion instead of your logic, by using feelings instead of facts, by talking about the cultural divide issues in society. I don't want to talk about kitchen table issues, common sense issues, infrastructure, the kinds of things that matter to most Americans. Instead, let's really dig into the culture wars. Let's talk about guns. Let's talk about the LGBTQ community. Let's talk about abortion. Let's talk about immigration, and in the most emotional terms possible, because I need you to be outraged and angry and fired up so that you'll show up and you'll bring some friends. And if those middle of the road people are turned off and exhausted, well, that's good too, because I don't know how they're voting. I'd like them to stay home. And that is incredibly corrosive to society. And so I think those two factors are combining to put us in this very dangerous place that is stealing our power as the people to elect the people that we choose to best lead us in this country, and have left us with some untenable choices. And I think that this assault on democracy and on truth is really harming us in society. So number one, it is harming our democracy through gerrymandering, because if you believe that the ends justify the means, you are doing anything you can to put your thumb on the scale. So in states with Republican-led legislatures, they stack the deck to favor Republicans. In states with Democratic-led legislatures, they stack the deck to favor Democrats. I am pleased to say that here in Michigan, we had voters, not politicians. Anybody here work on that initiative? Thank you. A model for our country. Voters, not politicians, that created a nonpartisan redistricting commission that decides how those lines are drawn. Incredibly important. Ohio is considering a similar proposal this year, and I'm hopeful that this will sweep the country, because I think it is a way to get back to fairness and truth and what matters. But that is a symptom of this assault on information. Voter suppression laws in a number of states, laws have been passed making it more difficult to vote in 2024 than it was in 2020. Georgia, Texas, Florida, Arizona, Wisconsin, to name just a few, have made it more difficult to do early voting, to vote by mail. In Georgia, it is even illegal to provide food or water to people who are waiting in line to cast their ballot. And why is that? I don't know about you, but where I vote in Ann Arbor, there's never much of a line. I stroll right up, maybe one or two. I cast my ballot and I'm gone, because we have lots and lots of election people. If you live in an affluent community, tons of people want to vote and want to help volunteer. Well, guess what? If you live in a poor community, there aren't tons and tons of volunteers, and there aren't tons and tons of equipment. And so the lines are very long. And so do you know who are not getting the food and water while they're waiting in a very long line? That is people of color, the poor, students, people who are likely Democratic voters in Georgia. And that is who this law is targeting. Brian Kemp, who is the governor of Georgia, who is a real hero of January 6th, right? He is a guy who pushed back against Donald Trump on January 6th and said Georgia's election was not stolen. It was fair, it was accurate, we've done audits, it was secure. And yet, he signed this bill into law. And when asked why, he said, to prevent all the fraud. So he's going along with the con in an effort to achieve political power. He is not telling us the truth. He's willing to go along with what the leader has told him to say so that he can advance his own political career, the political agenda of his party, whatever it is, his personal motive. It is also harming democracy in the kinds of attacks we are going to see this election cycle. I had a chance to visit with the Microsoft Election Security Task Force, who saw many of the threats that are coming our way from outside and inside our country. And they say there are three strategies that disinformers will be using this election cycle. One is to influence the outcome, another is to dampen voter turnout, and another is to diminish public confidence in elections themselves. Because there is an effort worldwide to destabilize democracy. Democracy, for us in the United States, since World War II, has been the key to our foreign policy, to lift up democracies around the world, to engage in democracy building. Because we believe in the United States that when other countries have democratic forms of government, then there are likely to be fewer wars, there are fewer refugee crises, and we will have better trade partners. But instead, what foreign leaders are telling their people is that democracy doesn't work, and they point to January 6th as evidence of that. After January 6th, a Russian official said, look, this just proves democracy doesn't work. American democracy is limping on both feet. They can no longer hold themselves out as the model for democracy around the world. in China, President Xi said, see, this just shows you democracy doesn't work. People can't agree on anything. What's better is to have a strong leader in government, because after all, the goal isn't democracy, the goal is prosperity. And I, as a strong leader, can deliver for you prosperity. Never mind that journalists and protesters and dissidents end up locked up because anyone who speaks out against the government is an enemy of the state. And so this disinformation and this trend is leading us to a very dangerous place and harming our democracy. I also believe that it is harming public safety. When people hear these rants that judges are in the bag for somehow Joe Biden is controlling the Manhattan DA and a state court judge who's been randomly assigned this case in New York. Not sure how that works. But you will see online attacks on Truth Social from Donald Trump that the FBI is a disgrace, that the Department of Justice should be called the Department of Injustice, that judges are engaging in election interference by presiding over these cases. Is it any surprise when the leader is saying all these things that there are people out there who hear these things and act upon them? When I was investigating cases involving ISIS, we called this radicalization. People would see these sermons from Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen telling people to engage in jihad where you are, to kill the disbelievers, because we are going to found an Islamic state. It is, to my ear, very similar when you hear people talking about a Christian nation and we have to stop these enemies, and calling these judges or police or others enemies of the people. The press is the enemy of the people. Is it any surprise that these judges are receiving death threats, that their clerks are receiving death threats, that public officials are getting swatted? You know what that is? Where somebody calls the police and says there's a barricaded gunman at the home of this person, and so they show up with a SWAT team with guns drawn and tanks. There was even a fatality in a swatting incident a few years ago where a person walked out wondering why on earth are all these police officers here, and was shot when he came out of the home. So it's an incredibly dangerous thing. After the FBI searched Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago home, he accused them of raiding his home. Of course, a search warrant means that a judge found probable cause to believe evidence of a crime would be found at a particular location, executed a search, seized documents. He accused them of planting evidence in his home. Of course, he later said he had every right to take those documents, so consistency is not a necessary element to any of this. And I don't care where you line up politically, if you're a Republican or a Democrat. I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about a particular individual who is assaulting the truth. Because what happened after he accused, falsely, the FBI of planting evidence in his home is the next day, to no one's surprise really, a man in Ohio posted online, "We patriots need to take up arms against the FBI because they are our enemy." And he went to an FBI office with an assault weapon. He tried to get in, was chased away, and later killed in a standoff with police. So I think that this assault on truth is causing us to be less safe, is encouraging people to engage in vigilante violence. And of course, the greatest example of vigilante violence, I believe, is January 6th, when now something like 1,200 people have been convicted, thousands more who probably will never be identified, tried to use brute force after an election, audits, and lawsuits all said that the election was won by Joe Biden, fair and square. People who still refused to accept that outcome tried to use brute force to prevent the peaceful transfer of presidential power for the first time in the history of this country. I mean, I can remember as a kid, the newscaster saying, and there it is, almost a miracle. Other countries can't believe we do it, and yet we do it every 4 years. The peaceful transfer of presidential power. There, we've done it again. Look at what a model we are for the world. Well, no more. No more, because on January 6th, we saw that disgusting, sickening spectacle of people trying to use brute force, physical force, to take what was not rightfully theirs. I don't know about you, but as a smallish person, I don't think I'm going to do so well in a world where brute force rules the day. We have laws. We have a rule of law because we recognize that in this country, we disagree about all kinds of things all the time. But we resolve our disputes in the ballot box and in courts. And then we accept the outcome. I didn't win every case I took to trial. And when I lost, I said, we respect the decision of the jury. Or I might disagree with the judge, but reasonable minds can disagree. And I certainly respect the decision of the judge because it is her role to make that decision. We need to engage in that kind of what authors call mutual tolerance and forbearance. I cite a book in my book called How Democracies Die. And one of the things they say is we have to accept the legitimacy that there is another political party in our system. Because if we don't, the whole thing comes crashing down. It's like being on the playground and say, I want to win so badly that I'm willing to cheat and take my ball and go home if you won't allow me to win. Well, that's great, good for you, but there's no more ball game anymore. And so if the party that loses does not accept the outcome of an election, then there's no ball game anymore. And we're going to lose the democracy that we have. The last thing I'll say about truth is this. In Putin's Russia, truth is an obsolete term. Putin, of course, grew up in the KGB. He knows the tradecraft of disinformation, and he uses it on his people superbly. He will give conflicting narratives of things that are happening. One day it was Ukraine who shot the missiles. The next day it was NATO who shot the missiles. The third day it was the United States who shot the missiles. Consistency is not important because, as I said before, the goal is to exhaust you. The goal is not to convince you that he's not corrupt, but to convince you that everyone is corrupt. Everybody gets impeached, right? It's no big deal. Let's impeach everybody, because then impeachment loses its teeth. Everybody's corrupt, and if everybody's corrupt, then truth is for suckers. Truth is for the naive. Truth is not what matters. Don't vote for the person who's most honorable or decent. Vote for the person who will get you what's yours. Think about the short term, and don't worry about anything else. I don't know about you, but to me, that is not the country I was born in, grew up in, or aspire to be. I think we need that mutual tolerance and forbearance. I think that we need to think beyond our political tribe. We think that we need to restore decency in public discourse. And I hope that all of you will at least consider that in your own affairs that you choose truth over tribe. So I'll finish there. Thank you. Questions? I'm happy to answer any question you want about what we just discussed, about cases, about anything on your mind. So, sir, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I was just wondering why you think it's so widespread, and it is widespread. And there seems to be a divide between urban and rural in America like never before in my lifetime. How do we address that?
Yeah. So the question is, it seems like this division is so widespread, particularly among the urban and rural divide. And I believe it is so widespread because people are stoking that division. I don't think this is an organically occurring division. I think if you meet people in society, people are lovely to each other. On social media, because of all of this baiting of people, I think that's where a lot of it comes from. And then, of course, the press reports what they see online, and so that reaches people even who are not online. And this idea of the urban-rural divide, I think, is again an effort to pit people against each other. Certainly people have different views depending on your life experience. If you grew up on a farm, you might think of guns as something I use to protect my livestock. If you grew up in a city, you think of guns as something used to kill people or commit crimes. And so it can be difficult to have a debate about that. But instead of having a rational debate, thinking about, does one size fit all? Should we have certain rules? Should we have other things? Instead, what political operatives are doing is stoking that division, telling the people in the rural community, the elites look down upon you, telling the people in urban communities, they'd rather have guns than children's safety in schools. They're selfish. So it makes you not just think about the issue, but they're trying to make you hate the other side, which is so corrosive to democracy. What we really need, I think, is leadership that seeks unity instead of division, which we have not had, as I said, since 2000, really, of people really trying to stoke division in society. And I think we're responsible for that, right? Because ultimately, we the people are the ones who elect our leaders. There's a great passage in a book that I cite in my book by Doris Kearns Goodwin, the historian. She wrote a book called Leadership During Tumultuous Times, where she examined 4 presidents and dealing with some of the crises in American history. And one of them was Theodore Roosevelt. And what she wrote was his times were really not so different from our own. They were going through a big economical transformation. Today we're going from sort of manufacturing to the tech industry and the knowledge and service industry. At the turn of the century, from the 1800s to the 1900s, it was the Industrial Revolution. There was a new wave of immigrants coming from Europe. We now had international newspapers that could tell us about scary things happening in far-off places like famines and wars and assassinations. And it's in a time when people could have become very fearful and leaders could have preyed upon that fear. But instead, Theodore Roosevelt was just the opposite. He said, what an incredible time to be in America. We have unbelievable opportunities. Automation can help us. We don't have to have children working in factories anymore. So let's pass some child labor laws. We have the ability to diversify our manufacturing base, so we don't need these mega giants anymore. Let's pass some antitrust laws so that consumers don't get gouged with other things. He welcomed immigrants. It was a time of opportunity and optimism. And instead, today, what we get is America first, isolationism, and fear. And so I think we can take a lesson from that and demand leaders who share that view of, all these things are coming for us, right? AI, all these things. Isn't it interesting how every article you read about AI is how bad AI will be and how scary AI is going to be and how the robots are going to take over? AI is going to be an incredible thing. It already is an incredible thing. I mean, anybody ever talk to Siri? Siri is AI. We're dealing with it all the time right now. AI is going to help us diagnose all kinds of medical issues. So rather than think about it, I mean, all inventions also bring with it some risk, right? The person who invented the airplane, I guess it's the Wright brothers, also invented the plane crash. Didn't exist before them. But does that mean we say no to planes? No, we lean in and we look at all the possibilities and all the great things that they can do. And so I think we need to get past the fear that people are using to exploit us and ask, like, what are you going to do? What's your vision for the future? We've got incredible opportunities here. Let's utilize it. Thank you for your question. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Going to your public corruption background, how much
Enforcement of public corruption. Thank you.
How much do you think, with the Soviet Russia interest in us, how much compromise is there going on right now that we may be subjected to?
Yeah, super interesting question. The question is, in light of public corruption, how much compromat is there out there? Which is a Russian term for people who are compromised and get used in that way. And so I saw that happen in individual cases of business people who, and boy, some of these foreign operatives are so clever about it. Russia, China, we had cases in a couple of other countries that I won't name, who will lure people in. They're on a business deal and they get a free dinner to start, right? And then a relationship, and then free tuition somewhere, and then an envelope of money. And they're kind of curious about all these things. But before they know it, they've taken so much that they've kind of crossed an ethical line. And then they're asked to do things like gather information for a foreign country. And so it is tradecraft, it is recruitment. And then the question, I suppose, is to what extent are any of our political leaders subject to this? I don't know the answer. I do know that Senator Menendez in New Jersey has been indicted for providing assistance to a businessman in Egypt and acting as an agent of that country. So it's possible that there is more than has been detected. It is, sort of by definition clandestine and under the radar. I sometimes wonder why it is we have so many people in Congress who are repeating Russian talking points, really obscure things about referring to cities in Ukraine and other kinds of things. Are they compromised, or do they just, really think that? It's hard to know, but it does cause me to wonder about some of the things, some of the things Donald Trump says about Vladimir Putin seems so strange to me. But it is a little bit of the strongman playbook to show fondness for other strongmen. It's about this idea of, the authority with which they lead their country, an admiration for that kind of thing. President Trump also said how much he admired President Xi in China because he has control over his people. And so maybe it is just an admiration. So I don't know the answer to your question, but at least a little, according to the allegations against Senator Menendez, who's on trial this week. So I guess we'll find out a little more about that one. Yes?
Yes. Could you comment a little bit on how this division has politicized the courts? I mean, 20 years ago, I never knew who appointed a federal judge. Now, every time it's a federal trial, it's an
Such a good question.
appointee,
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. And the question is, can I discuss how this moment of polarization is affecting the courts? I think it is affecting the perception of the courts. I do not think it is affecting the operation of the courts. I think there are probably a few exceptions. I'm not a fan of what I'm seeing by a couple of the justices on the US Supreme Court right now. But as an institution, the courts are nonpartisan. And I think in our hyper-polarized times, we have been trained to believe that everyone is on one team or another. You're on the red team or the blue team, Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal. And in my work as U.S. Attorney, it was neither of those. And it wasn't bipartisan, it was nonpartisan. And I think for some people, it's really hard to get their head around that because they themselves are hyper-partisan. And you're right about how now we always see the media report that Judge so-and-so who was appointed by President Biden or Judge so-and-so who's a Trump appointee. And it sort of suggests that that means that they're going to decide a case with a particular bias or viewpoint. And I think it's really harmful to public confidence in our courts. I worked for a lot of judges. I clerked for Judge Bernard Friedman in the Eastern District of Michigan. I mean, a lovely man. He was a Reagan appointee. I was an Obama appointee. Neither of us ever thought about politics whatsoever in anything that we did, right? I mean, I prosecuted Kwame Kilpatrick, who was a Democrat. We never thought about those things. And so I really worry that by always reducing judges to the president who appointed them, it does create this impression in the public that they're in the bag for a certain judge. Chief Justice Roberts wrote about this in his end-of-year report a few years ago. He writes kind of a report on the courts every year, and he usually picks a particular issue to talk about, funding or whatever it is. I think this year was about threats. But it was about that issue because Donald Trump kept saying, these Obama-appointed judges this, these Obama-appointed judges that. And he wrote, there are no Obama judges, there are no Trump judges, there are no Bush judges. We are all simply United States judges doing our level best to decide cases based on facts and law. And then Trump tweeted out, oh yes there are, Mr. Chief Justice, you bet there are. And then he kind of doubled down on all that. And so I think it's really harmful to society because judges are sworn to put all of that aside. I mean, certainly they have their own personal views about things, but to set all of that aside and decide issues based on the facts and the law. And I do believe they do their best to do that. Now, do people have genuine differences of opinion? Sure, because they have different worldviews, right? If you or I were to debate issues, we would probably come out to different places based on our experiences, right? Where did we grow up? What do we think? What do we read? What do we know? But we're still reading the facts, reading the law, and doing our best to apply it. And so I think there's a real disservice done when we think of judges as just one other political branch. All right, 24, we can take a couple more. Ann?
In your book you talk about solutions.
Oh, she's actually read the book. Go on.
But can you give us more specifics that we can walk out of here with today about things we can do?
Great question. Thank you. Solutions. Thank you for thinking of that. Yes, I think there are a number of things we can do, and I'm pleased to say that despite all the doom and gloom, the longest chapter in my book is the chapter on solutions. So I won't go through all of them, but a few. One is on social media. We can make some real common sense reforms through regulation on social media, but the tech companies have really pushed back, claiming that every effort to regulate social media is an affront to the First Amendment. And it's not. There are many things we could do without touching content regulation, which might have a First Amendment issue, by addressing the processes. So they have these algorithms that tell our accounts which messages to rise up to the top level for us to see. And there was a whistleblower from Facebook, a data scientist by the name of Frances Haugens, who testified that Facebook deliberately engineered the algorithms to push content that was designed to generate outrage. Because the more outraged we are, the longer we stay on the platform, and the longer we stay on the platform, the more they can charge advertisers for their ads and the more money they make. And so why are we all mad at each other all the time? Because Facebook is engineering it that way. So I think we could regulate the algorithms in a way that prevents them from doing things adverse to public safety and the public interest. I think that we could eliminate the bots that are on social media. Bots are these, AI-generated accounts that aren't real people. They are there to either pick fights with you or to push other false content. So if a disinformer is on there online with some fake post, these bots can amplify it. 100 people liked it or shared it because they were all bots. Bots are programmed to find keywords. If you post something about gun control, they'll come back and say, you're a fascist who wants to take away our guns. And if you reply, you realize you're simply arguing with software, right? You get that. So they're not real people. But they have great names like Patriot Girl or Eagle Grandma. Great names like that. So I think there are a lot of things we can do on social media. I also think more on the demand side, that's sort of the supply side, we could do a better job of educating our people in media literacy. So not just kids, but adults. When we read something, not just believing what we read when we see it online. It's easy to fall prey to falsehoods when you see something online if you are not media literate. I'll give you a quick example of a time I myself, believe it or not, fell for disinformation online. I'm a big sports fan, as you may know, Ann. And I read online that Patrick Mahomes, the star NFL quarterback, had said he refused to play another down until the Kansas City Chiefs changed their name to something that was not offensive to Native Americans. I thought, wow, all right, putting his money where his mouth is. Way to go, Patrick Mahomes. And using my emotion instead of my logic, I retweeted that and put that out there because I had to, share that with everyone in the world. And then later that day, I was talking to my husband and my son. I said, did you guys see that story about Patrick Mahomes not playing another down? They said, no, what are you talking about? I haven't seen anything like that. Like, oh, come on, I'm sure it must be all over the news. Another down, Kansas City Chiefs, Native American. Now, in fact, that sounds kind of fake. Now that I say it out loud, it does sound kind of fake. But it must be true because I read it on Twitter. So I went back and I looked for the post and it looked pretty good. There it was. It was sent out by ESPN, right? Credible, legit source. But then I looked a little more closely and I saw the account was not Sports Center, but Sprots Center. So I took it down. So I had fallen for disinformation and had spread it. So I think if I had followed the good advice of what a media literate person would do, and what I would hope I would do now is before passing it on, I would look for a second source, right? Don't believe the first source of everything that you read. Is anyone else reporting it? Because if it's a big story, certainly other outlets will have it. Another one, don't just read the headline, actually read the story. Because so often these days, the headline is just clickbait. They want you to open the headline, and then often the story bears very little resemblance to what's in the headline, right? Like the headline might say something like, world to end soon. And then you read the article and it says, no scientists think. What? It's just the opposite of what it says. So you got to read the article and not just the headline before you pass it on. Understanding the difference between causation and correlation. If you're looking at some sort of study, scientists say, people will do this or that. What was the sample size? Was it 2 or was it 2 million? Because that can make a big difference in the sample size. So anyway, those are some of the examples. And the last one I'll give you, Ann, is this about solutions. I think the solutions can begin with us by not being one of those people who cares about winning at all costs, about owning our opponents, about dunking on our rivals, because that is what so much of this discourse is about. People don't even care so much about who they're voting for, they care more about who they're voting against. People want to see that other person suffer, take glee in the misery of all those people who are voting for that opponent. I'm going to win. It's like it's become a sports battle and a contest instead of an experiment in democracy. And so I think we need to model the kind of decency that we want in a world, because we're not going to solve problems through political purity. The only way to solve problems is through compromise. And I think we can do that by showing that mutual tolerance, that forbearance, and that decency that will give people the kind of grace that we all need to come together to solve problems. So it's 1:30 and we'll end it there.